Hello and welcome to the Rodgers Brief. I'm Adam Rodgers. Thank you for watching and thank you for listening. This is the latest in the series that I've been doing on the ebook Deficits of Trust, which is my report on the events of the mass casualty of April 18th and 19th, 2020, as well as the Commission of Inquiry which studied those events. So this is going to be the final video of the main content of the report, and the two sections are going to be called The Future of Policing is Not Present and Ending Without Closing. And then if the video is not going on too long, we'll go and power through to the Summary of Recommendations section at the end. All right, so this is part 3, which is reviewing the Mass Casualty Commission itself, and the section is called The Future of Policing is Not Present. For those that have been, if you're just catching this video, there is a series of videos and I've put it in a playlist on YouTube, so it's easy to just go through the entire set. And if you're watching this and you'd rather just listen, you can catch this also on Spotify or Apple Podcasts as well. All right, so the future of policing is not present. In addition to panel discussions on domestic violence and associated themes, the MCC also held discussions on the future of policing in Nova Scotia. Experts and stakeholders discussed the existing structure, the possibility of there being a provincial force, and the ongoing development of policing standards. It was interesting in a sense that the MCC even included some of these discussions on their program, which by their very nature were anti-RCMP. I thought that perhaps they were trying to foster public discussion and debate over the issues, and perhaps even lay the groundwork for some bold recommendations in that respect. It would seem contrary to much of their earlier decisions, which seemed designed to protect the police, but there may be more going on than now seems clear. The thrust of the discussion on policing was that we should be thinking about it from a community wellness perspective, rather than simply focusing on such things as arrest figures and policing budgets, and that furthering police education while also detasking such things as mental health calls and potentially some domestic violence cases should be prioritized as areas for change. This would all be done with a goal of increasing what the experts termed police legitimacy. This is a state of being where the citizens approve and accept the police as being legitimate users of force and on-the-spot arbiters of criminal law, and also, crucially, that the police accept the people they are policing as being good citizens worth protecting and treating fairly. That second element was greatly lacking in the events of the mass casualty, where police did not trust the public with information for fear of inciting panic and potentially violent responses should a citizen have been given the information that the killer was dressed as a police officer and then having seen a legitimate police officer. It was also on display when the police did not respect and trust the citizens enough to be honest about what had happened when the police had a chance to answer questions in their early press conferences. These limited and highly controlled public communications undermined police legitimacy, and one of the early experts said that the trust that is the foundation of such legitimacy could take many years to recover. If there are to be changes emerging from the MCC with respect to policing, one of the first things to determine will be who is expected to lead that process. The Canadian Constitution says that policing is a provincial responsibility, but the actual divisions of responsibility involve some complexities. The area around Portapique is policed by the federally established and operated RCMP. The closest backup units to the local RCMP detachment are municipal police forces in Truro and Amherst. The killer had property in Dartmouth, and so the Halifax Regional Police became involved. The Police Act is a provincial statute, which dictates how policing is supposed to be structured. According to the Police Act, the Provincial Minister of Justice is in charge, with wide-ranging powers to direct police conduct and training, to deal with complaints against individual officers, and to review any aspect of policing. In a practical sense, however, it seems that little use is made of this authority. One of the specific powers granted in the Act is to allow the minister to make arrangements with the RCMP to police portions of Nova Scotia, and in fact, most of Nova Scotia is policed by the RCMP. When that contract was renewed most recently in 2012, the indications were that 60% of Nova Scotia's population, covering 94% of our land mass, was policed by the RCMP. Exceptions are Halifax, Cape Breton Regional Municipality, Truro, Amherst, New Glasgow, Stellarton, Pictou, and Yarmouth. Another complication is that 9 municipalities in Nova Scotia have individual contracts with the Federal Department of Public Safety, aside from the main provincial agreement to have the RCMP police their municipalities. In all situations, there are financial arrangements in place when backup is required for any reason. The Police Act says that the Provincial Minister of Justice may appoint the Chief of the Nova Scotia Police. It does not appear that this actually happens, or indeed whether anyone might be the Chief of the Nova Scotia Police. A new commanding officer of the RCMP was appointed in 2018, but that was only announced by the RCMP, not the Nova Scotia Department of Justice. Additionally, when Commanding Officer Bergerman retired and was replaced just before the MCC hearings were to begin last fall, this was not announced by the Nova Scotia Department of Justice. So, although policing is a provincial responsibility, it is the federal and municipal governments who have effective control, operational control over policing in Nova Scotia. The RCMP has a contract with the province that the province says extends until 2032, but which can be terminated early with 2 years' notice. I would be very curious to see whether there are other termination clauses in that contract. I suspect there are termination provisions relating to performance rather than simply the 2 years' notice. Most employment or ongoing long-term contractual arrangements would have some such clause, and it may be even an implied term. Either way, it is likely that the RCMP has a great deal at stake in the Mass Casualty Commission. If their performance is seen by the commissioners and/or the public as sufficiently bad, there will be contractual implications. The Minister of Justice also has the power to order a review of any aspect of policing. Under the previous Liberal government, there was an indication from Minister Fury that something of a comprehensive review of policing had been ordered, but no details or documentation to support such an order has been made public. And when the new government took over in 2021, it appeared that little had been done to design any kind of review process. The MCC can now be viewed as a prelude to a formal review of policing in Nova Scotia. In the course of the Commission testimony, we have discovered some policing errors that may be considered individual judgment calls, but much of the evidence reveals systemic management, interoperability, and oversight issues within how Nova Scotia is policed. If he is not prepared to give the RCMP their 2 years' notice based on what we already know, then the minister should at least initiate a formal review. There were 2 discussion panels held by the Mass Casualty Commission dealing with responses to critical incidents. The first one dealt with how best to prepare the police and other first responding stakeholders for a critical incident. The second session dealt with how to incorporate civilians, 911 operators, and others into the response package. Krista Smith facilitated the first discussion. There was an array of international experts on hand to give their views. They included Dr. Kimmo Himberg from the Police University College in Finland, Dr. Hunter Martindale from Texas State University, Bjorn Ivar Kruk from Norway, Carrie Murray Bates from the Toronto Police Commission Communications Organization, Superintendent Wallace Gosson from the York Regional Police, and Cape Breton Regional Police Deputy Chief Stephen McKinnon. Each of the individuals has had experience in critical incidents, and many of them also provide instruction to police officers and organizations on how to best respond to such incidents. As with other MCC panels, there was no discussion about the specific facts of Nova Scotia RCMP response to the April 18th, 19th, 2020 mass casualty events, but rather more general guidelines as to how best to prepare for such unknown occurrences when they take place. While it is impossible to predict every occurrence, or perhaps even very many of them, the advice from these experts is to do as much training as possible and to involve potential stakeholders from the community when doing so. For example, if there are any schools in the area or major industrial operations, police would want to develop a relationship with the leaders and those individuals within the institutions whose cooperation might be helpful during a critical incident. Superintendent Gosson also teaches critical incident response at the Canadian Police College. He stressed that the most common problem with critical incident responses is not usually anything to do with specific tactics chosen by the first responding officers or the specific weaponry they have available, but rather confusion as to who is in charge. He said that even if 2 or 3 equally ranking officers are the ones responding, somebody needs to take or be assigned command of the situation. Such comments certainly bring to mind some of what we have been hearing about the confusion in the overnight hours of April 18th and 19th, 2020, regarding which commanding officer was in charge at what time. The comments from Superintendent Gossin were echoed somewhat by Dr. Himberg, who said that leadership must be clear and that only when a situation escalates so as to be beyond the capacity of the first responding officers would command be transferred to a command center. In Finland, they have just a few command centers, and these are not intended to be mobilized or develop on site where the incident is taking place, but rather exist in a static location. Having an effective command center was a theme throughout the critical incident panel discussion. There needs to be well-trained people on the front end taking calls and helping citizens be effective first responders. All relevant information needs to be noted by the intake person and then effectively transmitted to the commanding officer so that they can make use of whatever information is being provided in the course of formulating their response. Communications with the first responding officers was discussed by Ms. Murray Bates, who emphasized that information provided to the officers on the scene is critical and must be handled thoughtfully and thoroughly. The RCMP model of policing does not fit with the advice of the experts. Their organizational mistrust of the citizens exacerbated the damage done during these shootings. They have demonstrated an unwillingness or inability to reform. They have damaged relationships with their neighboring forces, and they have steadfastly refused to accept that anything really went wrong. The Police Act says that the province is the level of government responsible for policing, but according to the most senior Provincial Department of Justice official who spoke at the MCC, Haley Crichton, the province wants nothing to do with running a police force. When Ms. Crichton spoke during a panel on the best policing structure for Nova Scotia, she said that the province was satisfied to remain in an oversight role. Given that she was the person put forth by the province to speak on that topic, we can consider that to be the position of the current government. That hands-off approach was echoed in the closing remarks from Samantha Paris, lawyer for the provincial DOJ. Lawyers for the province barely spoke during the entirety of the MCC, and the 20-minute closing submission was the first we had seen of Ms. Paris, a relatively new lawyer being 6 years into practice. Ms. Paris echoed what Ms. Crichton said, and again suggested that the province does not want to be responsible for operating a police force, despite being responsible for it under the Police Act, and said little else other than urging the MCC to acknowledge the modernization that is taking place with respect to policing standards in Nova Scotia. Other participants in the earlier panel on the best policing structure for Nova Scotia recommended a regional model, which would seem to mean 5 to 8 police forces throughout the province, perhaps based on geographic zones used for health, education, or economic development organizations. Under this model, policing standards and technology would be matched up among the regional forces to ensure interoperability was intact, while more specialized services might be centralized in the Halifax or Sydney population centers. There is not much of a conceptual difference between a regional model and a provincial force. One argument against a provincial force would be that it would eliminate the uniforms and legacies of existing municipal forces. There may be a way to preserve these legacies in symbolic ways, with perhaps an effort to incorporate existing logos into whatever emerges as the Nova Scotia Police logo and uniform. The RCMP and others have argued that it would be too expensive to police Nova Scotia without the subsidy that comes from the federal government. This accounts for roughly 30% of policing budgets. There is no conceptual reason why such a subsidy should not continue, even without the RCMP as the police force of choice, and the entire cost discussion seems to be a red herring. Some know the price of everything and the value of nothing. Having a new Made in Nova Scotia police force would be of tremendous value and could be a model for others. Other provinces are examining this question as well. British Columbia and Alberta may soon be switching to provincial police forces rather than keeping the RCMP in place. Others already have one in place. We could look to these models, as well as international examples, to mold a new entity that serves us much better than the current patchwork. The RCMP claims that it has new leadership in place in Nova Scotia and is capable of a level of reform that would restore their legitimacy. I doubt they have persuaded many that this is really the case. For each major problem identified with the RCMP, someone has a recommendation that may seem to address it, but really amounts to only a partial solution. Throughout the MCC, we have heard from witnesses who said the RCMP was unprepared. They recommended changes that would have them better trained. We heard the RCMP has not instituted changes from previous external inquiries and reviews. They recommended better oversight and follow-up this time. We heard that the RCMP does not investigate domestic violence cases very well. They recommended changes to how those cases are handled. We hear the RCMP is not trusted by marginalized communities. They recommended more training and outreach. We heard the RCMP is not accountable to local or really any civilian oversight. They recommended larger budgets for those responsible for oversight. At some point, the scale of the effort needed to reform an organization is close to or less than that of starting over. The benefits to Nova Scotians and the many good RCMP officers who would hopefully remain with the Nova Scotia Police Force of a fresh start is difficult to measure, but they are real. Police have such a special and unique function in the lives of the people that they serve that true reform is a worthwhile societal project. Ending without closing. The final week of proceedings featured the closing submissions from each of the participants, with one notable exception. Contrary to common practice and expert guidance from Professor Ratushny's leading text on inquiries in Canada, the lawyers for the MCC did not give any closing remarks. This was very strange and brought back to mind the various times during the proceedings when the role of Commission Counsel was discussed by Commissioner MacDonald. In the Desmond inquiry, participants were given 1 hour to speak and a 40-page limit on written submissions. Though that may seem like a long time to speak, in reality it was impossible to fit everything into what we would have liked to say. It is appropriate to impose such limits, however, and it forces everyone to focus on the main areas of potential contention and those pieces of the story that matter most to your client. As each party prepares their closing submissions and makes their recommendations, one of the calculations they will make is to count on other participants to make certain key points, so that they do not have to use their own time doing so. In the MCC, for example, it would have been clear to other participants, based on his questioning throughout the proceedings, that Josh Bryson from Chester Law, representing the Bond family, was going to speak to crime scene management in his closing. So, others could safely leave that point out of their own presentations if they were pressed for time. The main foundation or backstop to the closing statements, however, is typically expected to come from inquiry counsel. Professor Ratushny notes that one of the advantages of having inquiry counsel who are independent from the commissioners, as Commissioner MacDonald has repeatedly stated the MCC lawyers to be, is that the commissioners can receive comprehensive and detailed submissions from Commission Counsel at the conclusion of the hearings. Professor Ratushny points out that while parties granted standing will have an interest in some aspects of the inquiry's terms of reference, no other entity aside from Commission Counsel have the same comprehensive and intimate knowledge of all of the evidence and witnesses and their interrelationships. He says that, therefore, inquiry counsel's submissions can provide a blueprint for the commissioner's final report and can also provide a thorough and foundational account against which the commissioners can compare those submissions from the participants. In addition to the fact that they did not give closing submissions, a comment from MCC lawyer Jamie Van Wart as he was entering exhibits on one of the mornings when submissions were taking place may have inadvertently revealed that commission lawyers were not as independent as has been presented. He was talking about some of the new documents being exhibited and mentioned that they would be useful when we write the final report. In other words, he saw no distinction between the commissioners and Commission Counsel, which is contrary to what we have been led to understand throughout the inquiry. In a sense, this report of mine is a substitute for the closing submissions of Inquiry Council, though perhaps not as comprehensive in some areas as they would and should have done. My perspective is a disinterested one, and I am aiming to make recommendations that are in the public interest, as Commission Counsel were to have done. While their lawyers did not give closing remarks, the commissioners themselves each did. Like nearly everything else they said from the microphone during the proceedings, the closing remarks of the commissioners could have been and may have been written entirely before the MCC proceedings even began. Namely, they just listed the titles of the foundational documents and other reports in a slow, solemn tone that seemed intended to add weight to otherwise vapid comments, followed by thanking everyone involved. In a possible sign of how the MCC may treat outside ideas, Commissioner MacDonald also remarked that while everyone did not always agree with the commissioners' decisions, that, to their credit, they remained committed to the process. This was a patronizing way of addressing the participants' criticisms. Rather than express any degree of humility or even hint that the MCC may have taken a wrong turn here or there, Commissioner MacDonald essentially said that even though you people did not always understand the great wisdom behind some of our decisions, good for you for trying. The commissioners ended by urging the public to help implement the recommendations that are to be made next year in the MCC's final report. This is indeed a vital element of the MCC process, as the recommendations to come from that report are non-binding to any level of government and can just be ignored if the governments wish to do so. The only way anything will actually happen is if the public finds the MCC recommendations compelling, agrees that they should be prioritized by our governments, and encourages the relevant government to act. It remains to be seen whether the MCC has fostered the goodwill and credibility necessary to have people take up their mantle in that way. They have undermined their own credibility numerous times before and during the proceedings, and have adopted a much criticized closed communication strategy that echoed that of the RCMP they were tasked with examining. It may be asking too much, especially in advance, to expect people to advocate for unknown and unpredictable recommendations emerging from such a tainted process. Summary of recommendations. 1. Replace the RCMP in Nova Scotia with a provincial police force as contemplated by the Police Act. Existing municipal forces and willing RCMP officers stationed in Nova Scotia should be incorporated into the provincial force. New training programs should be developed based on some of the models identified through the Mass Casualty Commission, including unique considerations for policing in Indigenous communities. 2. Detask non-violent elements of domestic violence away from policing. Permit and encourage vigorous restorative justice approaches for cases of intimate partner and domestic violence, and dedicate more resources to temporary alternate housing options for offenders and victims. 3. Provide all police officers with direct access to Alert Ready for use in active shooter or other similar situations where members of the public may be in grave danger. Police should be encouraged to provide information to the public at all stages of an investigation and be protected from liability for reasonable mistakes. 4. Critical incident command centers should not be mobile units to be set up in spaces local to the event, but rather in static locations with dependable access to appropriate technological resources. 5. The provincial government should exert control and take over ownership of the TMR radio system and increase the capacity for emergency responder use of the radio so as to ensure GPS capabilities and multiple user capacity are available at all times and in all locations in Nova Scotia. 6. The Criminal Intelligence Service of Nova Scotia needs to have access to all police and border services databases, and should proactively work with local police resources to identify potential public safety threats. 7. Public inquiries should have more clearly defined guidelines and ongoing political oversight so as to prevent the harmful mandate misinterpretations that took place with the Nova Scotia Mass Casualty Commission. 8. Public inquiries should avoid predetermining the expertise that will be called, but rather wait until the evidence has been sufficiently presented and tested. All right, well, that's it. That's the ebook. Thank you for reading this, or thank you for listening along and watching along with me. I appreciate everybody who took the time to do so. I hope that this will be preserved electronically as a public record of what went on in both the mass casualty events themselves and then the commission of inquiry that followed, so that, like I say, many of the mistakes that were made by the commission in their mandate and in their work can be corrected in future inquiries throughout Canada. So again, thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for listening. You can catch me in my YouTube channel on other topics as well, and hopefully I'll be around to discuss further legal issues as they come along in the public sphere. So again, thanks to everybody for watching. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you again